Okay, for part D then, you are being asked to explain the relationship between the prey and predator, as shown in figure 2. So the prey starts out high and decreases. So if we're going to explain, we have to say why it is that it's decreasing. And the reason is because the predator is increasing. Okay, so here the relationship between the predator and the prey is that as the predator population increases, that is going to cause decreases in the prey population. But eventually there won't be enough food for the predators and they'll start to decline, at which point that will allow prey population to increase. You could also mention something about negative feedback, and mentioning that would get you a mark as well. It's an example of negative feedback. You can also mention that it's a stable equilibrium. But if you just wrote down these two phrases, you wouldn't get 2 marks for that because the command term explain. Okay, part 2A asks you to draw a typical survivorship curve. Now this is not the same as the population curve, because here you're looking at the proportion of individuals surviving over time. So with a K species, you start out with 100% surviving. Okay, so as soon as the moment that they're all born, we count that population. And then over time, you're going to decline in the population as the population gets older. But it doesn't drop off steeply because we have high parental care in here looking after the young, so it's not going to decline very much at all. If you actually measure this line, it would be going down ever so slightly because obviously there is some mortality in the offspring of K-selected species. This line here is R-selected species, so you get lots and lots of individuals dying at first, but of course, you know, these have much higher numbers, so this 100% over here might be 100,000. So that we end up with this population size down here being similar to the population size, or perhaps even more, than the K-selected species, and then over time, eventually, of course, going to 0 from that initial cohort of 100, going down to 0 here. And we don't need to know about the type 2 one. So type 1 is K, type 3 is R. Remember to label your axes, so you must have time and percentage or proportion of organisms surviving on the y-axis. Okay, density-dependent factors are factors which affect a population and depend on the density of the population. So, for example, if we have a population of sparrows, and there's just 5 in the population, and they have plenty space, they're not very dense. If one of them gets a disease, it might pass it on to another one, and they both might die. But if we have hundreds of sparrows in a particular area, same area, that's much more dense, the chances of that disease being passed along from neighbor to neighbor is much greater. So disease and the spread of disease depends upon the density of the population. The other thing, some of you mentioned these, would be resources. If we have a low density of an animal or a plant, the resources that it needs will be able to be accessed by that individual. But in a dense population, there will be far more need, more competition, and so that's going to limit the population. So this links back to limiting factors, things that affect the size of the population. Disease won't be a limiting factor in a low density population, but disease will be a limiting factor. In fact, the population won't be able to get beyond a certain density because disease will start to spread. And one of the things that we've been really interested in is in human beings. You know, when is that going to kick in for human beings? So When will we reach our carrying capacity? So carrying capacity is going to depend on some of those limiting factors. And some of those limiting factors, like space, are dependent on density. So the question, part 2, asks how we can overcome these, and we've overcome them many, many times. So for example, disease. Disease is a density dependent. How do we overcome it? Well, we have the technology of medicine. And we always have the threat of a disease breaking out, a new virus, that would be density dependent and it would spread around the world and we'd have no treatment for it. But so far, we've been able to avoid that through the use of medicine. We can import food. So whereas the sparrows in this particular area, they can't ask some other sparrows to fly in some avocados from New Zealand, but we can do that. And so even if our resources are getting low, because we are very dense, we can still import resources in even though we don't have the means to grow them.